Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate your time, dedication, and interest in learning something new. Today, we are going to be talking about First Nation people, the myths and realities of substance use disorder by me, prevention educator Ruth Delpino. I always start off my presentations with who I am, just in case people want to know where I'm coming from and what informs what I do and how I navigate these presentations. I am a prevention educator at the Mercer Council on Alcoholism and Drug Addiction. I am the Mercer County Grant Coordinator. I have a Bachelor of Arts in Global Studies, Political Science, and American Studies. I'm certified to teach English as a foreign language, leadership skills training, life skills training, my apologies, and leadership. So here we are moving forward. Why this presentation? I also start my presentations with this as well, because I think that it's really important for us to know why we are attending these things, but also understanding why a presentation exists in the first place. So first thing, this is not to scare you. This is to inform you. This is not a parenting class. You are the best parent for your child. You know them the best. You know, you've known them longer, probably than they've known themselves. And for those that are working with youth, this is also for you as well. Any tips and tricks and things like that to understand different realities of these children and youth that you are working with is always an asset to the field that you are in. Also, my perspective is shaped by my approach and by my learning experiences, meaning as a prevention educator, I have a lot of opportunities to be informed by different realities and different forms of education. So what I learned from there, I put into this presentation and then move forward with the new information, and we form as we go. So if I learn something new, I will always make sure to update the presentations that I've learned something new on, such as the marijuana and cannabis policies that are coming up later on. Also, this is evidence informed and some evidence based. So what that means is this is informed by the evidence I find, and I present it in a way that it cohesively makes sense. And this is some evidence based, meaning this is the evidence and the studies and all of those sorts of things. The evidence based stuff will be in the end of the description or at the end of the presentation, as well as in the YouTube description if you are watching this on the YouTube channel. I also have some disclaimers before we start, because I feel like it's truly important for us to understand where we are standing in order for us to go from there. One, there will be mentions of violence. Native Americans and First Nation peoples do not have a what is called a very bloodless history. So we want to make sure that we are honoring those sorts of things that have happened, but also understanding why they have happened. There are mentions of substance use disorder, which the title says substance use disorder, so I feel like that's not necessarily a huge disclaimer. It is not up to people to decide the suffering of others. If people say they are hurting, then they are hurting. We are not here to dispute that, and we do not play devil's advocate on people's pain. I'm not an expert on the matter of Native Americans and First Nation experiences. All the claims made are not based on my opinions or experiences, but through the voices of this population I am trying to amplify. The voices will be the voices of the community, and there are some mentions of statistics and abuse some people may find disturbing. Also, each piece of art or background in this presentation is actually made by a Native American artist. So I will be crediting all of them at the end of the presentation. I just put that here because this painting in the background is actually made by Oscar Ho of the Potawatomi Nation, I believe. But once again, he will be credited at the end of the presentation. So I always want to sort of have a baseline of where we're going and then jump off from there. So what can addiction look like? First thing, addiction can be a choice. People can choose certain things, right? Addiction can be genetic. It can be a disease, environmental, a response to trauma, a normal brain response. And all of these sorts of things are really important for us to realize, because substance use and addiction are two different things, but sort of interwoven, such as a rectangle, or a square is a rectangle, but a rectangle isn't a square, sort of that logic, where addiction is the end point to a substance use disorder, meaning a substance use disorder is a range of actions and stages before someone is truly dependent on a substance. And that's where the addiction comes in. So when we are looking at addiction and treating it and understanding what that looks like, there are so many different avenues in which we are able to use to help the person who is struggling have help and have those good resources. But when we are all looking at this, addiction can be a choice. There are arguments that it is genetic, it is a disease, it can be environmental, it can be a response to trauma, all these sorts of things, right? But when we're talking about this, I think that it's truly important for us to look at the lens of especially something that is environmental, a response to trauma, and a normal brain response, where when people are surrounded by things that hurt them, when people are surrounded by things that aren't good for them, it's really hard to make the best choices. And it's really hard to see if there are any other ways to cope. And that's where we're sort of looking at this response to trauma. It talks about coping skills. And there is a great presentation that was done about 2 weeks ago by the executive director of the Mercer Council, Jocelyn Cooper, who talks about empowering you. And basically what she says is that substances are things people use to cope. Meaning that when we are meeting people where they are at, when we are looking at their maladaptive coping skills, we are still saying, you know what? You may have gone through trauma. It may have been very difficult, but you survived. And let's honor that survival, because in order for people to survive off of trauma, sometimes they do turn to things that are really hard for them later on in life. So for someone who may have suffered from sexual violence, or someone who may have suffered from physical abuse, these are the sorts of things people turn to because maybe they don't know better. Maybe there's environmental factors. It's a response to trauma. Somehow it's more easily accessible because of the healthcare system we have. There are lots of things that exist here for us to understand first. So when we use medicine or we use drugs in a response to trauma, then it can be something that is honored. It can be something that says, you know what, you may have turned to alcohol because things are hard, but now that you've gotten past that, you've gotten past that stage where you're no longer just surviving, you want to thrive. Let's hopefully get you off that coping skill so that you can learn to have better and new ones. And I think Jocelyn does a very good job at explaining that. This also will be linked at the end of the presentation. So I do have a wonderful website here. It's the Indian Health service. And basically what they talk about specifically is the Native American populations and how they are really trying to have good information, solid information, and tools for providers for them to understand how to interact with Native American communities. And it's just one of many resources that I will have at the end of the presentation. But I think this is a great start, especially when we're talking about alcohol and substance abuse programs, which I think should be more plentiful and for people to explore on their own time. And once again, if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat. Any responses, put them in the chat as well. So we're going to be talking about some of the nitty gritty things, just because in order for us to understand Native Americans and First Nation peoples, we have to recognize their history. We have to recognize their trauma, because how people understand history and how people understand the way that people interact with their environment is really based on how their peoples before them have interacted with their environment, because practices, coping skills, social stigma is all passed down through generations. That is also something known as generational trauma, which I talk extensively about in all of my other presentations. But we'll be touching upon a lot of things, but this specific saying was something that I think a lot of people have come into contact with and interacted with. It is, kill the Indian, save the man. Now, we're going to be talking about this in the way that this sentiment really informed Indian boarding schools. And what were Indian boarding schools? Well, they were also known as reform schools. And about 200 years ago, on March 3rd, I believe, 1890, there was the Civilization Fund Act. And it basically ushered in an era of assimilationist policies, meaning that they said if these Native Americans, they called them Indians at the time, if these Indians are able to be assimilated into Western culture and to be taught the ways of our people, of the white man, then they will act civilized. They will be saved. They will hopefully have a better chance at life. And this is how it sort of informed a lot of these reform schools. And there have been unofficial documents and firsthand records of a lot of different things that happened in the Indian boarding schools. But during this era, it lasted from 1860 to about 1978, but there are actually records of Indian boarding schools being open to this day. And because there have been unofficial records and firsthand accounts, one of the last Indian boarding schools closed in 2007 under the leadership of actual Native American tribes, because they had used it as actual just boarding schools later on. But their legacies are very, very distraught, very hard to listen to, very hard to come to reality with. So I'm just going to preface with that there are some numbers coming out that may be a little bit hard for people to hear. And once again, if you are watching this in the YouTube video, I can actually have you skip towards the parts where I'm no longer talking about these hard numbers. But Canada's legacy, actually, Canada is really known for their interactions with Native Canadians and the First Nation peoples that existed on their land. But their boarding school policies were actually modeled after the United States policy, meaning that their policies were enacted later than ours. And their last boarding school, I believe, closed in the late 1980s. So during their time when people were at these residential boarding schools, they had about 150 in Canada. And under that, about 6,000 children were officially counted as dying in these reform schools, meaning due to the practices, due to the harshness and the realities, the starvation, the systematic ethnic cleansing that had happened, about 6,000 children had died over the course of a little bit more than 150 years. Now, that is with 150 schools that existed in Canada. The United States has 357. And those numbers of deaths are actually unknown because of the extensive realities of these Native American children. So a lot of these children had passed away, and most of them at the time when they were going through these reform schools, children just passed away and they would just bury them under the school grounds. So there have been cases of people finding reform schools and just finding children of unaccounted bodies and not necessarily being able to identify them because they were just buried and were not necessarily given a death record. So the death records that do exist, they're called dead files, and they are under the National Archives in Washington, D.C. And there was one specific piece that was done on this sort of prolific reservation school, and it was called Carlisle Indian Industrial School. And I kind of want to read this through the expose that was done because I want to make sure that I am not butchering any of the information, because these are things that people should be taking very seriously, but also there's so much misinformation that if I were to say it wrong, that I just don't want to do that. So they had done an expose, and I will link the study and everything like that in the description as well. But this was a really poignant point to make, where this specific person who was researching the National Archives in Washington, D.C., basically said that it holds the majority of thousands of student files. The children's death records are kept on index cards in shoe boxes, simply labeled the dead files. Now, here's where the excerpt comes in. But the records themselves are incomplete. All of the male children with the last names L through Z are missing. And this is just with the Carlisle Indian Industrial School that they're talking about, McBride tells me. And the bodies might not even be at Carlisle. Children who didn't die on campus were sent home to die, but the tribes might not have recorded the death. Others died at a nearby sanatorium. At least 11 died while on the so-called outing program, which put Native children to work for little or no pay for white families in Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey as housekeepers or farm laborers. Now, a lot of people talk about Native Americans as if it's something that existed far more west, right? A lot of the time when we're sort of talking about it, we talk about the misplacement, or we don't talk about the locations of these Native American tribes. But a lot of the atrocities that have happened actually did happen in the Northeast, and specifically in New Jersey. And I do want to talk, or at least introduce the different peoples, indigenous peoples that exist in Jersey. And this is a great resource. This is actually Wikipedia of all places, but it is a very good informed place to start because it also has resources and the bibliography at the bottom as well. But these are some of the New Jersey state recognized tribes, which means that there may be other tribes that existed, but these are the ones that are located in New Jersey and recognized by the state. So you have the Ninitok Lenni Lenape, Powhatan Lenape Nation, the Ramapo Lenape Indian Nation, the Intertribal American Indians of New Jersey. There are a lot of different tribes that are existing to this day, and that those are the ones that have just existed that we have found the remains of. So it is not something that is outside of us. It's not something that doesn't exist for us. It very much is a part of our present day history and something that may have been lost to time. So we're going to be talking about the substance use disorders and the substance disorders that are present during when we're talking about Native Americans and their interaction with substances. The statistics are much higher than any other marginalized group. Okay, so I just want to preface with that. I'm going to be reading some numbers. So I'm going to be throwing numbers at you. And I do apologize if we sort of lose ourselves in some of it, but here are the things that I will be talking about. So there was a study and a survey done, the 2018 National Survey on Drug Use and Health. And this included going to reservations, specifically reservations, and talking to Native Americans about their substance use, just so we have these on record to know where things are needed and where people need resources. So this is in 2018, and the rate of the past month was 35.9%, and past year was 54.3% alcohol use among Native Americans. Now, this is significantly higher than any other marginalized group. I actually believe that I did an Asian American usage rate about maybe a month ago, and what was talked about there was that during the Asian American usage, or when they were doing the survey about that, they actually had the lowest, which I believe was about 6% overall. So that is significantly higher. And they're going to be for a lot of reasons, but we're going to be talking about that after I go through some of the numbers. Nearly a quarter of Native Americans report binge drinking in the past month, which is 22.4%. The rate of Native Americans with an alcohol use disorder is 7.1%, and it is higher than the total population, 5.4%. 3 in 10 Native American young adults about age 18 to 25 report binge drinking. And 1 in 11 report heavy alcohol use in the past month, and 1 in 10 have an alcohol use disorder, meaning that there are 10% Native American youth in the United States that have a substance use disorder or an alcohol use disorder. Oh, this is specific alcohol use. So that doesn't even count the other substances. And also 1 in 6 Native American adolescents, 12 to 17, engage in underage drinking. And this is the highest rate of alcohol use of all racial and ethnic groups in the United States. So 1 in 6 12 to 17-year-olds engage in drinking. So that is a lot to take in, a lot of numbers to talk about. So we're kind of going to go back to a lot of the reason why, and we're going to be talking about this basically in the next slide or two. But when we are talking about Native Americans, what we really need to understand is that their history is such a huge part of how they interact with the world now. And because a lot of them are still on reservations, because people are still on reservations, there is a concentrated pocket of poverty and a concentrated generational trauma that exists within these reservations, because once again, the residential schools and the Indian Reformation schools closed in 1970 something, and some of them still were open until 2007. So we don't exactly know all the practices that happened during that time, meaning that there are people who have children, who had children, who had children that are still going through this generational trauma because they weren't given the resources to actually address those traumas and to actually address the sexual abuse, the violence, and the emotional abuse that may have happened during that time. The other thing is that the preservation of culture is so important in these areas that it can be really difficult for it to happen when a lot of the regulation of Native Americans is through the government and they're not able to have their independent resources. There is much better now, but earlier on, it was very hard for them to have a really good start on these resources because of the realities that they had to face and because of the regulation that the population had to go through. So we'll actually be talking about that in the next slide of all things. So when we started talking about this, understanding historical ramifications is a truly important part of this, and word choice especially is something that is really important. So you may hear a lot of people call Native Americans or First Nation people Indians, and that is because of a lot of different reasons, but more specifically because Christopher Columbus had come over, landed on what is now the modern day Dominican Republic, or Haiti, I believe, Hispaniola in general. And he had thought he had hit India. And then we had met people there. They looked different than him, they acted different than him. And he actually called them Indians because he thought he had landed on the Indian soil. So, first thing is they are no longer called Indians. That's one thing that could be made clear. The second thing is also knowing that using the word alcoholic is no longer something that is acceptable for a lot of different reasons, but understanding that word choice is really important for a lot of people because it gives a connotation of what you feel about that population, or it shows a sharing of history that is not actually accurate. And so that moves on to my next point, where we have shared and traumatic histories dealing with socioeconomics that I will touch upon a little bit later. But I do want to share this right now. So I have a couple of studies that I'm studying here, but in humans, low socioeconomic status increases risk for addiction exponentially. And there are a lot of different reasons for this, but I just want people to think about that while we're going through this presentation as well. Understanding history is a truly important part of this. Understanding that we don't know everything, that we are not privy to everything, that the more resources we have, the more information we have, the better for us to have the right things to say, the right interactions to have, and the environment to create for people that want to share their stories and use their voices for good. Also, I'm going to be starting a video. It is a very good video on this person who actually does art, Native American art, and he does it based on his tribe. And what he essentially has said, and what he starts with, is the stories that people share through art are a really important part of the Native American population, but also the pop culture that exists. So he does it better than I can. And if you do go to this YouTube video, there are a bunch of comments about the residential schools that existed during that time. And just forewarning, there are a lot of mentions of violence in the comments because of people sharing their stories on the residential schools. So here we go.
The hierarchy that is set within those spaces that immediately tells every child and ultimately every adult that is having education here in the United States what our value is. So for example, we know who Christopher Columbus is, but we don't know the name of the people that he came into contact with. I mean, I know, you guys might not know. But that's important because it already tells you he's important and we are not. In fact, it goes so deep that he came here and he thought he was in India, and so he called the people he came into contact with, which is actually the modern day Dominican Republic, he called them Indians, and 500 plus years later, we all know that he was lost at sea, but we still call indigenous people Indians. Abraham Lincoln has this incredible legacy in history. He signed the Emancipation Proclamation. But what you don't know is he also, the week before the Emancipation Proclamation was to be enacted, he signed off on the largest mass hanging in American history. 38 Dakota men who were being hung for little more than just to make an example of them. It happened on the 26th, so it was the day after Christmas. I'm not saying this to make a divisive statement about Abraham Lincoln. I'm telling you this because when we omit things from history, then we immediately give value to those things. And what this does is this sets us up with something that is really damaging. When we think of Indians, we think of things like this. When I was a kid, there was these Looney Tune cartoons that were pretty popular. And you know, people could look at this and they think it's no big deal. It's just a cartoon. It's satire. It's funny. But here's what happens. Young children see this. Native children see this. And it immediately tells them what the world thinks of them. That they are a caricature. They are not to be taken seriously. But further than that, it tells your children what our value is. And it informs your children what we look like, what we talk like, what we act like, and all of it is pigeonholed into one single thing, which is this. And so we see things like this. Pocahontas, she was actually 10 years old when she went through the things that she went through. And these images are burned into the American psyche. They're burned into American culture. They're burned into Western culture. And so they manifest themselves at things like Coachella and Burning Man. And next thing you know, we have sports mascots that are somehow representing every Native person in the land. There's over 567 tribes that are federally recognized in the United States. There's several hundred more that are not recognized, that are usually recognized by the state. There's over 300 different languages. This is just in the United States. This doesn't count Canada or Central America or South America. And yet, we're supposed to accept these things as an honor. In fact, these people have no context to what we are and who we are, so much so that they believe that they're not just honoring us, but that they are carrying our legacy. So this brings me to my work. As an artist, I've found that the only way to function as an artist is that you have to work within the bounds of what Western culture expects you to do. They expect us to be painting cowboys and Indians. People are heading down to Santa Fe and they want to buy a nice Indian painting by a nice Indian to put in their home because it's Indian. And as a result of that, we're one of the few subcultures in the art world that is actually being controlled by a Western buyer's market that decides whether or not there's value with our stories.
Okay. So I could listen to him talk all day, actually, because that presentation and the way that he talks about it is so interesting. But I want to make sure that we are given enough time. But I highly suggest you to make your way over to his TED Talk, because he talks more about how the art industry is actually regulated, and one of the only industries that's regulated by Western culture and not Native Americans, based on supply and demand. So there are a lot of different realities to it. And if you're also wondering, you can buy his art as well. We have something in the chat. Give me a second. It's an awesome clip. Thank you. Yeah. So yes, it is a great clip for a lot of reasons, but it also is important to know that representation in media matters, because the representation in media and the representation that we have when we're talking to youth who happen to be Native American or First Nation, we are setting an example on how others are supposed to treat them. If we show things in our classroom, if we talk about things a certain way, then we are giving permission to people who don't know a lot about the culture to interact with that youth a certain way as well. So it is very important for us to do the work and to do the research to make sure that we are giving the best impressions and the best resources to these populations that are truly suffering. I think that he did a great job, and I will link the TED Talk below, because I could listen to him speak all day, honestly. So we're going to be moving forward. And are the statistics accurate? So I talked about before how roughly more than 50% of Native Americans have engaged in alcohol use in some capacity within the past month in the 2018 National Survey. So I want to talk about some of the arguments that are also made why people say that alcoholism in general is so prevalent in Native American cultures or Native American populations. Well, first thing is they're on reservations. So that's something that we need to make clear right now. But second thing is, for a long time when reservations were made to be, the United States has a history of sort of blaming the victims for the things that they have gone through. So, for example, a lot of people during that time basically said, well, you know, they do a lot of rituals with alcohol. That's probably why they have such a high rate of alcoholism, which is where we have this really common term called firewater. I don't know if anybody has heard the term before, but essentially they said that's like basically the same thing as saying that because the alcohol is so prevalent in these practices for Native Americans, that's the reason why they are primed for alcoholism. And a lot of the time, the argument was also to say that Native Americans were genetically primed for alcoholism. There are quite a few different studies, especially this one here, The economichardship.org/2015, they did a very extensive study, and they basically said, no, Native Americans are not genetically more susceptible to having an alcohol use disorder of any sort. So we're going to put that argument to bed. But the other thing is, when we are talking about the statistics, yes, these statistics in general are accurate in the way that the information was taken, but also understand that the statistics may actually be higher, because imagine people that aren't actually able to come to terms with the alcohol use disorders and the substance use disorders they have. So in general, the numbers we have in the United States when we're surveying any population is actually relatively low compared to how many people will admit what is going on. Collecting those numbers is very difficult, but can you imagine having that high of a number and also understanding that it could actually be more? And that is something that we need to take into account as well. So I also want to talk about ACEs for a second. I have talked about ACEs at length in many other presentations, but this is still something that is really prevalent and for us to understand when we are interacting with Native American and First Nation youth. ACEs stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences, and it is linked through generational trauma. Lots of other things, to be honest, whether it's abuse, substance use disorders present in the household, a whole slew and list of things. I talk about it extensively in this presentation called Talking to Your Children Before It Matters. And I also link the ACEs test in the description of the YouTube video below. I will also put it in this one as well. There was a study done by the Journal of the American Medical Association where they were talking about children being affected by poverty. And I do want to talk about this now, where I had alluded to it about 2 slides ago, I believe. Because there are a lot of things that exist around this sort of presentation, but understanding that Native Americans are not the only population that suffer with substance use disorders at a heavy rate, but to understand that anybody who deals with poverty, anyone who is ingrained in poverty, goes through substance use disorders and interacts with negative and maladaptive coping skills. And this is because they were affected by huge wealth gaps in between the poor and the majorly rich. So there are many different types of addiction, not just alcohol. So I want to make that clear too. And there are a lot of different parts of this that I'm going to cite. So bear with me as I go through some of the numbers. But basically, all types of addiction, not just alcohol, are elevated in Aboriginal populations around the world. And so it's not just something that's privy to the United States. It's also unlikely that people are primed in genes for addiction in these populations just because of that, but it's more about the environmental trauma, the generational trauma that these people collectively have shared together. Also, there was an interesting study by the Journal of the American Medical Association that I'm going to cite right now, and it says heroin addiction rates are highest among the poor. And they sort of asked, so what does this show us? The environment people are in is a part, the environment people are a part of is more the failing of giving them resources rather than a failing of the person who has the substance use disorder. Now, that is something that may be controversial to some, but also understanding that poorness, poverty, the environment people are in, coping skills, all of that, all of those things can be mitigated through resources and healthy coping skills. They also said the link between trauma and addiction is not a dispute, and the earlier the trauma, the worse risk of addiction becomes, whether it's losing a parent young, being emotionally, physically, or sexually violated, experiencing a natural or man-made disaster, or witnessing violence. The risks add up. For example, one study of nearly 10,000 people found that those with 4 or more types of these adverse childhood experiences have a risk of alcoholism that is 7 times higher than those that have not experienced any of these ACEs. Similarly, boys who have 4 or more ACEs are nearly 5 times more likely to inject drugs than those with none. And also goes on to say the sexual violence of girls in general as well. But I also touch upon another presentation, sexual violence and substance use disorders, where I heavily touch upon that. So I will also put that video in the description below. Also, it clearly shows that there is a difference between simply having money having more money and having more money that you can make. So what they did actually was they were given yearly payments of $9,000 as part of a deal for a casino on this particular Native American reservation. And it had a relatively small amount of money, but the impact was huge in that this relatively small amount of money meant that 35% of those who were 16 when the parents began receiving payments developed problems with alcohol and other drugs, but only 23% of those who were 12 did. The 12-year-olds were the youngest studied, but other research suggests that younger kids might do even better. So basically what that means is they give these payments to these reservations. At the time, it was a yearly payment plan, and this was something that was a relatively small amount of money, but did make a big impact because these children and these people that were living on these reservations and these casino areas were given resources and given money to buy the things needed for their populations. And what they found was that what they found was that people who were younger, that were surrounded less by poverty, had a higher chance of not having any substance use disorder and not having any, and having less negative impact because of it. So that is something that I thought was really interesting. Means that these wealth gaps and inserting money into spaces and people that need it really does make a difference. That these numbers show that given the resources, these numbers do make a difference. So I also want to talk about reservation life, considering I've been talking about it a lot, and that maybe some people need some context to sort of understand what that actually means. Now, this is a UK-based magazine. It's called huckmag.com. They have a lot of different exposés on a lot of different things, but I just found this really interesting article on reservation life because the UK had actually, reporters from the UK had made their way to a tribe in South Dakota, I believe. And this was a very interesting article for a lot of different reasons, but this is in South Dakota, and this is sort of what the life of South Dakotans looked like now. And I have some excerpts from this from this article that I wanted to read. And it basically, this man in particular, his name is Rich. And it says here, unable to get a job, Rich and his brother have both been involved in gangs. In addition to a high suicide rate and high school dropout rate, the residents of Pine Ridge Reservation face other daily battles. And it goes on to say what those daily battles are. Throughout the reservation, the diabetes rate is 800% higher than the national average. And on this reservation especially, an average life expectancy of only 50 years old. Their life expectancy is 50 years old. The unemployment rate of Pine Ridge hovers around 80%, with a majority of the population living under federal poverty standards. And as you can see, there are a lot of different reasons why. They have dilapidated houses, older cars. The sentiment can be very difficult to work with. And they don't really have a lot of resources in terms of infrastructure. So also here is a great way to basically put this. A man sleeps in White Clay, Nebraska. White Clay is a population that is population 17, and just 2 miles from Pine Ridge, consists of 4 liquor stores and sells an average of 12,500 cans of beer a day, mostly to the Pine Ridge Reservation. So this man is passed out from using alcohol, or from engaging in drinking alcohol. And yeah, so, and it's in White Clay, Nebraska, with a population of 17 and 2 miles away from the Pine Ridge Reservation. So this is sort of what the houses look like. There's a lot, I should have done a warning real quick. There's a self-harm warning. There are some scars here. There are a lot of different things here. Lots of different realities that exist, dropout rates, teen pregnancy, things like that. So this is a great article to read through. There's a lot of photography that I thought is actually really nicely shot, because it does do a great job at doing like a daily life of people in certain populations in certain spaces. So this article will also be linked in the description. And so I also wondered if there was a space for educators to sort of look at the way that reservation life happens, and for people to use it in a good way, right? So I actually read this when I was younger. It's called Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian, and it is a wonderful book. It's by Sherman Alexie, who is the person that basically sort of shapes the narrative of Native American life in the United States, and sort of brought the Native American life to the forefront as part of a mainstream effort for people to understand what that looks like. So it is a very, very good book, and I highly recommend educators to put it as part of their curriculum. So now I have a video on reservation life, and this person basically talks about how he attends a funeral for his uncle who was murdered by his brother, I believe. And he sort of just talks about the feelings around reservation life and what that means. And I think that he would do a much better job than us just looking through resources. So,
By a man you could virtually call his cousin.
oh, my apologies. My apologies. Gotta get through this for one more time. Okay, here we go. Gotta make sure the sound is on.
Years ago, my uncle was burned alive by a man you could virtually call his cousin. Our elders will always preach to love ourselves, but how am I supposed to love myself if my people don't even love each other? At his funeral, my great-grandpa told me, when I was a boy, I was forced into a school until I became a man defined by the people who killed and raped his grandparents. But he continued with a tear in his eyes, I stayed strong because back then we had to be. Who else would have taken care of my parents? Nowadays, it's backwards. I got my kids asking for rides or to walk them home because they got too drunk. The events that led to where we are today should have never happened. He was right. He wasn't talking about the funeral. He was talking about as a people. I don't know how everyone else got there, but this is my story. When I was a kid, I saw the world like every other child sees it. It's in my palms. I can be an astronaut. I can be an actor. I can be on TED Talks. Well, probably not the last one. I wasn't as big of a nerd as I am now. It wasn't until preschool I started to realize where I fit in this world, in this nation, inside and outside of my own reservation. It's not normal for my parents to fight this much. It's not normal for my mom's breath of reeking of alcohol. My cousins have the same issues. In elementary school, they always ask, who are your role models? Who do you strive to be? Who are your superheroes? Thor, Captain America, blonde hair, blue eyes, they look just like you. My superhero will never be in a comic book. He has brown hair and brown eyes. He's the soul and spirit of the Ogallala Lakota warrior that once was. In middle school, the alienation got worse. In football, they called me Tarzan. That's almost as cultured as Redskins when I think about it. I guess that helped me realize how people viewed me, how people viewed my culture. That's when I decided to cut my hair for the first time, because I was afraid. In high school, things got worse. Stories trickled in often. Your uncle's an alcoholic. Your cousin had a kid in high school. Your other cousin had to get her stomach pumped. Some people even had the audacity to tell me, I hope you don't end up like your mom. You don't know her. I know all you see her as is an alcoholic. I still love her. I know we all struggled to get here. And yes, despite my appearance, I am 100% sober. But the point of that is I stay sober because I seen my family lose themselves. But most importantly, I stay sober because I know it will numb the pain that I feel like it has for my family before me. But at what cost? Love, future, life itself. I saw my mom for the first time in years at my uncle's funeral. She was drunk. The irony of it all was that's how we got here. I guess we're all addicted to something. What will numb your pain? I guess I was lucky. I got into music. I got into writing. But that's not the point. The point is it happens in our backyards, and you will never have to deal with it. But maybe you'd walk with a chip on your shoulder too if you can live in my shoes when you're told you're not expected to make it past 50. And if someone in a generation before me has already done this, I wouldn't need to be here. So my generation, all I ask is for helping hands, for culture, for a place of belonging. And I want to say this for all marginalized people, all First Nations. We are not defined by oppression. We are not defined by the obstacles that we had to avoid. All centuries of everything that held us back will never define us. We are not victims. We are heroes. We are creators. We are builders. We're the artists, the writers, and singers in tomorrow. We are the superheroes for tomorrow's comic books. We're the blood, sweat, and tears that make Native Americans proud. But most importantly, I have to thank all who is still fighting, who is fight for that pride. I know who have lost their lives, who are still struggling till this day, and to those who will struggle tomorrow. And your fight will never be in vain. Rest in peace, Jason Harley.
Okay. So he was talking about rest in peace, Jason Harley, and that was his uncle who was set on fire, and he had to attend the funeral. So I think that it is a very poignant piece for us to look at, for us to understand that there are people that are still suffering with the ramifications of substance use disorder in these areas, and for us to also understand that there are people who are actively fighting against the stigma, and it's not as if they are taking it lying down. There are many Native Americans who are very vocal about the realities that their people face, but also knowing that they are flourishing, that they are able to live fulfilling lives, and that there are people out there who are the ring bearers for justice and being superheroes in their own right. So we also need to address that part, that the reservation life is hard. It's a hard reality, but it's not the only reality, and that there are people that are actively trying to make sure that people live a fulfilling life and that their people have their voices heard. So here we go on from here. And I want to sort of close out my presentation with what can be done. How could we help? Obviously, these numbers are hard. These numbers are hard to work with. These numbers are hard to sort of face and feel like you're fighting, but understand that there are so many things that we can do. The first one is do not hide history. Where it can be taught, it should be. There are many spaces where history in its own right can be taught in a way that is digestible, that is well-informed, that is evidence-based, that talks about the realities of many different types of people. Also, believe people when they talk about their struggle. Their struggle is not yours to debate, their struggle is theirs to share. Know the resources in your area specific to the populations you work with, meaning if you are working with Black and Brown children, if you are working with LGBTQIA plus youth, if you are working with Native American and First Nation youth, these are the people and these are the spaces that you can sort of know, and know that if you don't know the answer, somebody else will, and that there are resources out there, and there are so many resources to the point where it is very difficult for us to not find those resources anymore. So understand that that is something that more people could really use, and could also work on just actively being engaged in those sorts of things. Listen to the stories of people who want to share them. Sometimes the stories are the hardest parts to listen to. You see the statistics, you see the substance use disorders, you see the surveys, but listening to the stories of people who want to share them is such an important part of that aspect, because one, Native American culture is very founded upon the idea of sharing stories, but also knowing that stories are where people have their humanity, and recognizing that is a huge part of their healing and of them moving forward. Put credit to where it belongs. Representation matters. Have interesting and complex stories and conversations about people that are respectful and well-intentioned. Also, monitor changes in behavior if you are interacting with any youth. Be involved in their lives, know what's going on, ask them how school was, ask them if there are any friends that they made recently. Just know what's going on, and by that you will be able to monitor changes in their behavior. Also, lead by example. If any of these are sort of sort of a surmising list of things. Lead by example, represent things in a way that matters, represent things in a way that you are able to lead as an example for these people that may not have the coping skills or the resources to really be their best selves. So lead by example, and also know that people learn a lot of things from a lot of different places, but children are so impressionable. And for us to lead by example is a gift for them to know what to do in situations where they may not know what to do. I also end on quotes just because I feel it sort of surmises what the presentation is about. And this is by Sherman Alexie, who is the sort of representation on Native American culture. And he does a great job at reiterating the points and experiences Native Americans have, but also just being a really good voice for Native Americans in general. He's a poet, a writer, a filmmaker, has many tens of 20s of books that are talking about experiences and reservations and things like that. So I have two quotes where it says, well, of course, we Indians have lost everything. We lost our native land. We lost our languages. We lost our songs and dances. We lost each other. We only know how to lose and be lost. And in the same conversation, I want to put at the end where he said, I realized that I might be a lonely Indian boy, but I was not alone in the loneliness. There were millions of other Americans who had left their birthplaces in search of a dream. And I believe that is by that is in the absolutely true diary of a part-time Indian. So yeah, so we have two quotes here. And what I sort of want people to take out of this is it means that people become better when they are not alone. To understand that suffering happens, to be lost, to lose others, that's part of life, that's part of reality, that can be part of people who are marginalized. But also understanding that these people and people who have lost should be given spaces to grieve, should be given spaces to understand what they're feeling, and given resources to flourish and move beyond what their reality is. Shared suffering, understanding, and empathy can lead to shared healing. And it takes a person's reality and give those who are suffering a chance to be different, to do things differently, and flourish beyond their environment. So if we give people access to the information, the understanding, and the reality of those who are hurting, and sort of be a lens to that, we can change their realities in amazing and drastic ways. So thank you for being here. Thank you for everything you do. Thank you for wanting to learn something new. Next week, I will be talking about gender identity and substance use disorders. That should be really interesting. So I am very excited to start that journey as well. So thank you all. See you next week. Bye.